In the early years after World War II, in towns like Sacramento, in Bakersfield, California, society wore a veneer of prosperity and stability. The GI Bill had opened doors for returning veterans, and post-war industrial growth seemed to promise a brighter future for every American family. Yet beneath that hopeful surface, the lives of young women and children, especially those without a strong support network, were often precarious. In the 1950s and 60s, an unwed teenage mother was more than a social embarrassment. She risked ostracism, legal limbo, and financial ruin. Welfare programs existed, but they were underfunded, bureaucratic, and critically mired in stigma. A girl who became pregnant outside marriage faced not only the physical hardships of childbirth, but also the emotional violence of a community that judged her and discounted her worth. For many families, the solution landed squarely on the shoulders of the immediate kin. Instead of turning to social services, a young mother might be sent back to live with her own parents, trusted elders, who in theory would protect her. In practice, without proper oversight, that safe haven could become a cage. It was a mistake many made then, and even now, assuming that because someone is family, they will act with love rather than self-interest. Grandma Teresa's story reminds us that kinship is not an automatic safeguard. The label grandfather or mother does not guarantee compassion, and blind trust in familial loyalty can leave a vulnerable girl exposed to exploitation. Compare that era to today's reality. A teenager who finds herself pregnant can access Planned Parenthood, legal advocates, and grassroots support groups focused on maternal health and anti-trafficking initiatives. Modern laws in California explicitly prohibit forced surrogacy and human trafficking in child protective services. CPS is tasked, at least on paper, with investigating any credible allegation of child endangerment. Of course, these institutions still fall short in many cases. Reports of undertrained CPS workers, overloaded courts, and bureaucratic inertia are all too common. Yet, the availability of legal recourse and community organizations marks a crucial difference. A young girl tempted by a quick financial solution for her struggling family has more paths to safety than Grandma Teresa ever did. In the mid-20th century, however, even obtaining a birth certificate or social security number could be a hurdle for an unwed mother, making her and her child effectively invisible to government oversight. Any attempt to formalize a surrogacy arrangement was inherently extra-legal, negotiated privately, behind closed doors, often in a living room or a lawyer's back office, if a lawyer was involved at all. Without formal contracts or regulatory scrutiny, the terms were entirely dictated by whoever held the power, typically the man with money and the elder relative, who stiffly judged a girl's worth by her ability to produce an heir. Families in poverty felt backed into a corner, eviction notices, outstanding medical bills, and no steady income. The promise of easy money for a young girl to bear a child for someone else might sound outrageous today, but back then, it was whispered about among desperate social circles. One of the most common mistakes people make, still to this day, is believing that a financial incentive alone will solve systemic problems. Grandma Teresa's mother, Irene, scrubbing floors and washing laundry around town, probably thought, if only we had enough cash to eat properly, to pay the rent, to keep the landlord's eviction notices at bay, everything will fall into place. And when Gerald, the stern grandfather and retired serviceman, offered a deal, an arrangement that reframed his own granddaughter as a fertile field rather than a child. Many might have accepted it out of sheer desperation. But what money cannot replace is a childhood, an education, and the fundamental right to bodily autonomy. Even a modest welfare check or temporary shelter from a social worker could have kept that door closed on the nightmare that followed. In other words, the quick fix of paid surrogacy was a false economy that exacted an unimaginable emotional toll. And yet, Lady Justice herself was reluctant to intervene. In those years, police departments and local sheriffs were far more likely to view family drama as a private matter. If neighbors tipped off officers about strange comings and goings at an older man's house, they were often told, "It's nothing we can do without formal charges." The concept of forced pregnancy or sexual exploitation was not widely understood. It certainly wasn't classified under modern human trafficking statutes. After all, the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act would not come into existence for another 40 years. Back then, the prevailing wisdom was that a man could do as he pleased, so long as society's polite veneer remained intact. For today's viewers, understanding that legal vacuum is essential. We tend to assume that if something horrible were happening, someone would step in. But in Grandma Teresa's Bakersfield, the people who might have intervened, social workers, public defenders, or police, were either under-resourced or simply uninterested. The lesson we can draw is this: don't wait for a perfect system to protect the vulnerable. If you see a red flag, a teenager mysteriously withdrawn, a family dynamic that seems off, whispers of arrangements, pick up the phone. Call CPS. Reach out to a trusted nonprofit like Polaris Project or the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Better to overreact with concern than underreact with apathy. There is a second lesson here, more subtle, but no less important. Educate yourself and your community about the rights of children and the resources available. Host workshops at local schools or churches. Spread the word about confidential hotlines. Too many people shrug and say, "That could never happen here." Yet Grandma Teresa's story began in a quiet suburban neighborhood, not some remote, lawless enclave. The injustice took root in a family's living room, under the glare of a father's solemn photographs and a grandfather's stern silence. By shining a light on the legal and social context of post-war California, we do more than set the scene for a harrowing personal tale. We arm ourselves with the knowledge to prevent similar abuses today. We recognize that poverty can be weaponized, that desperation can be manipulated, and that emotional ties can be warped into instruments of control. We learn that a criminal act need not look like a gun or a prison. It can be a handshake over a kitchen table, a whispered promise in the night, a doctor referred by a trusted relative. As we move into part 2 of our exploration, we'll delve deeper into the specific mechanisms of exploitation, the secret contracts, the sales pitches, and the methods by which powerful men could conceal their crimes under the guise of medical necessity. We'll also compare Grandma Teresa's ordeal to other documented cases of forced surrogacy and human trafficking, examining how patterns repeat and how modern victims sometimes find themselves in eerily familiar situations. But before we do, remember this: every child deserves a childhood, and every adult must recognize the warning signs. When we spot those signs early, we change the story. In Grandma Teresa's Bakersfield home, the promise of quick cash took on a darker meaning when her grandfather Gerald broached the subject of helping a wealthy gentleman, Dr. Augustus, by offering his young granddaughter as a surrogate. To modern ears, This sounds unbelievable, but in that time and place, it was disturbingly plausible. Let us unpack exactly how an arrangement like this could slip under the radar, who profited, and why it stood on such shaky legal and moral ground. First, it's crucial to understand that what Gerald proposed was never formalized in any court or under any recognized California statute. Instead of a transparent agreement with signed, notarized documents, the deal was struck in the shadows. A whispered conversation over the garden gate, a handshake in the parlor. In legitimate surrogacy, today's surrogacy intending parents work through accredited agencies or licensed attorneys. Every agreement is drawn up with the full knowledge of the surrogate, her legal counsel, and often a third-party guardian ad litem appointed by the court. Medical protocols, psychological evaluations, and clear financial terms protect both parties. By contrast, Grandma Teresa's arrangement had none of these safeguards. There was no neutral attorney to explain her rights, no independent psychologist to assess her capacity to consent, no separate escrow account for distribution of funds. Instead, Gerald received lump sums of cash for the family, and a naive 13-year-old girl was left to navigate assembly line pregnancies without any comprehension of her autonomy. Tragically, this kind of clandestine private surrogacy left her completely vulnerable to exploitation. Under modern U.S. law, any scheme that coerces a minor into sexual or reproductive activities falls squarely under the umbrella of human trafficking. The Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, defines trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. By that measure, forcing a child to bear multiple children for strangers is not only surrogacy gone wrong, it is in every sense trafficking. Though the TVPA wouldn't be enacted until 2000, California's penal code in the 1970s did criminalize statutory rape and child abuse. Yet, because the operation was framed as a medical arrangement, enshrouded by family authority, local law enforcement often refused to intervene. A doctor's office or a home visiting midwife seemed legitimate. Overheard whispers about arrangements were dismissed as rural gossip rather than criminal conspiracies. This glaring legal loophole allowed Gerald to traffic his granddaughter repeatedly with near impunity. Cases similar to Grandma Teresa's have surfaced even in recent decades. In 2016, a Philadelphia couple was convicted for running an underground surrogacy ring that targeted low-income women and minors, some of whom lived in violent homes. They promised medical care and financial support, but instead turned those women into reproductive commodities. In 2018, an investigation in Florida uncovered another operation where a fearful mother sent her teenage daughter off to live with a supposed benefactor, only to discover too late that her child was being forced into a cycle of pregnancies for well-heeled clients. These modern cases share the same hallmarks: recruitment of vulnerable minors, promises of money or security, lack of legal oversight, and profit extracted by traffickers sitting at the top of the chain. The primary difference is that today we have stronger statutes and a more robust public awareness. Still, these operations persist, reminding us that exploitation finds fertile ground wherever desperation and secrecy meet. Even now, people sometimes believe that money can justify extreme measures, that a family's poverty excuses decisions that harm its youngest members. Grandma Teresa's mother, Irene, wrestled with this very thought. She rationalized, "At least my baby will be alive, clothed, and fed, even if she's not with me." This is a typical rationalization, treating the child's basic needs as the highest priority and overlooking the catastrophic emotional damage inflicted by forced separation and repeated sexual abuse. Another dangerous misconception is the idea that doctors and midwives, medical professionals, are automatically protectors. In Teresa's story, a midwife facilitated home births, but never questioned why a child so young was repeatedly delivering babies. A doctor billed as Dr. Augustus presented himself as benevolent, offering vitamins, checkups, and expensive cologne. Any sign that he might be complicit in abuse was overshadowed by his social status and the veneer of medical authority. It is vital to remember that professionalism in title does not guarantee ethical behavior, especially when oversight is absent. Insist on transparency. Whether you're exploring surrogacy foster care or any form of child welfare arrangement, demand clear contracts, independent legal advice, and court supervision. Transparency exposes bad actors and affords every party a chance to walk away if the terms become abusive. Know the warning signs of trafficking agencies, like the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Provide training to recognize red flags. Sudden changes in behavior, unaccompanied minors in adult-controlled scenarios, or pregnant teens with older mentors. If something feels off, report. It's better to act on a false alarm than to dismiss a real crisis. Don't confuse poverty, relief with exploitation. Offering money, clothes, or shelter can look like a generous act, but if a minor's bodily autonomy is at stake, it is coercion, not charity. True assistance empowers the recipient to choose, not binds them to high-stakes agreements they cannot negotiate. Leverage community and legal resources today. Organizations such as Polaris, Project Shared Hope International, and local child advocacy centers exist precisely to guard against these abuses. Community education programs, legal aid clinics, and anonymous tip lines create safety nets that simply didn't exist for Grandma Teresa. Hold professionals accountable. Doctors, midwives, social workers, and law enforcement officers must be trained to spot abuse, even when it's disguised as a medical or family matter. Mandatory reporting laws require certain professionals to alert authorities when they suspect a minor is at risk. Use those laws. When Dr. Augustus first arrived at Grandma Teresa's home, bearing chocolates for the perfect little surrogate, he truly believed he could manipulate a child into service without consequence. Gerald believed he was simply securing the family's future. Irene believed she had no other options. And the system, law enforcement, social services, even neighbors looked the other way. Yet, in the very midst of this orchestrated cruelty, small acts of courage began to flicker. Jeanette, the kindly herbalist, quietly taught Teresa to use natural remedies to pause her fertility. A neighbor's silent offer of a borrowed camera became the tool for capturing those damning ledger books. A strategic tip to a curious journalist set the stage for public outrage. Together, these courageous acts formed a countercurrent that would eventually break the trafficking ring wide open. By piecing together the hidden financial ledgers and photographing each line of profit, Grandma Teresa built an irrefutable case. Her body was not a family heirloom to be traded, but a sacred vessel, violated for profit. When she handed those photographs to the Sacramento Reporter, the world finally saw what had happened behind closed doors. In Part 3, we'll explore the psychological armor Teresa developed to survive decade after decade of abuse, how dissociation and post-traumatic stress shaped her inner life, and how she found the strength to begin the slow process of healing. But it all started with recognizing the trafficking for what it was, refusing to accept that family could justify exploitation, and using every available channel, legal, journalistic, and communal, to demand justice. That is a lesson that echoes today in every community where vulnerable children need someone to stand up and say, "This is wrong." In the quiet hours of the night, when the world fell silent, and Grandma Teresa lay alone on the narrow cot in Gerald's dimly lit spare room, her mind would drift away from the cruel realities pressing upon her body. She learned early on that if she could simply step outside of herself, even for a moment, she might avoid the rawest edge of her fear. This survival mechanism, known to psychologists as dissociation, became Teresa's refuge and her prison all at once. Dissociation is, in essence, the mind's way of saying, "I cannot bear this," and temporarily lifting the sufferer above the scene of trauma. A woman in a studied study by the National Center for PTSD described her own experience as floating above her body, watching events unfold from a distance like a movie I was forced to endure but couldn't touch. Grandma Teresa's version was subtler. At first, an emotional numbness that crept in as the foster father's accomplices grew bolder, then a fuller-fledged sense of detachment, where pain became a distant echo rather than a sharp cry. Yet dissociation comes at a cost. Over time, those separated moments solidify into gaps in memory, a fractured sense of self, and the slow corroding of one's ability to trust reality. For Teresa, the years of pregnancies, 10 in all, blurred together. She could recall the particular scent of Dr. Augustus's office cologne, the weight of hot tea in her trembling hand after a forced conception session, the metallic echo of her own heartbeat as men she barely knew entered her bedchamber. But she could not always piece together which month or even which year a given event had occurred. Without guidance or understanding, she blamed herself for this peeling away of life. In silence, she carried the shame of being broken, of having moments stolen from her mind. She did not realize at the time that her coping strategy was not a sign of weakness, but a signal her psyche was in crisis and needed help. By contrast, survivors helped at centers like the Survivor Alliance Center in Chicago report a different path, from dissociation into integration, from numbness into full engagement with life. Therapists there teach grounding techniques, simple actions like naming 5 things you can see, 4, you can touch, 3, you can hear, 2, you can smell, and 1, you can taste, to pull the mind back into the present moment. At first, such exercises felt impossible to Teresa, when every somber creak of a floorboard threatened to transport her back to Gerald's house. She feared anchoring herself too firmly would let the terror flood back all at once. But gradually, as her new husband, Sebastian, introduced her to a patient psychologist referred by Jeanette, she learned that the opposite was true. Reclaiming her body through grounding was the first step toward reclaiming her story. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is more than nightmares or hypervigilance. It can show up as chronic fatigue, psychosomatic pains, a haunting sense of guilt or shame, and avoidance of any situation that remotely resembles the original trauma. Even something as benign as supporting expectant mothers in a community program. Teresa discovered she could not tolerate baby showers, maternity wards, or surprise gender reveals. When she and Sebastian volunteered at a local food pantry, she would sometimes flee the room at the sight of a stuffed baby doll on a donation table. Her body would coil as though bracing for an assault. This reaction is common in a 2017 survey of domestic violence survivors published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. Nearly 80% reported strong physiological responses, racing heart, sweating, nausea, when the slightest reminder of their abuser's face or voice surfaced. Just as Grandma Teresa flinched at the possibility of new clients knocking on her door, many survivors learned to avoid not only reminders of their trauma, but also life's ordinary joys, for fear of triggering an emotional avalanche. But avoidance, though instinctive, perpetuates suffering. Unprocessed trauma embeds itself deeper when left in the shadows. That is why modern trauma-informed care emphasizes both safety and gradual exposure. The survivor must feel protected enough to explore painful memories in a controlled environment. For Teresa, that meant long, slow sessions with her therapist, peeling back each layer of fear one at a time. It meant sitting in a quiet chair with Sebastian just outside the room, hands ready to catch her if she sank into tears. It meant returning to Bakersfield briefly many years later, just to stand on the dusty porch where it all began, so that the physical space could lose some of its power over her mind. Along the way, Teresa learned about peer support groups. At a small church basement in Riverside County, she met other women who had escaped human trafficking, domestic violence, and forced labor. They shared stories, sobbed through knitted blankets, and taught each other that trauma survivors need community as much as they need therapy. "We are not broken," one survivor told her. "We are pieces that can be reshaped." That simple reframing of identity, from victim to survivor to thriver, helped Teresa glimpse the possibility of a life beyond the cycle of abuse. Yet there are pitfalls, even within the healing journey. One common mistake is believing that therapy is a one-time event, a quick fix you graduate from, rather than an ongoing process. Grandma Teresa, exhausted by years of neglect and exploitation, nearly dropped out of counseling after 6 months, convinced she had done enough work. But trauma does not neatly resolve on a timetable. Her therapist gently reminded her that, like a chronic physical ailment, diabetes, asthma, hypertension, PTSD, can require lifelong management. The goal is not to erase every memory, but to ensure those memories no longer control her daily life. Another misconception is that therapy must be clinical and harsh. That feeling vulnerable with a stranger is a sign of continued weakness. Teresa's first sessions with the psychologist were awkward. She stiffened under the bright lamp, tensed at the pen tapping on paper. But the therapist, trained in warm empathy, used storytelling and metaphor to gently coax Teresa into opening up. "Imagine your memories as pages in a book," she said. "We're not ripping the pages out. We're finding where to place them in a new narrative, with a beginning, middle, and hopeful end." That narrative-building approach transformed Teresa's scattered recollections into a cohesive life story she could own. A third pitfall is isolation. Even as Teresa slowly reclaimed her mind, she sometimes withdrew from friends and family, fearful they could never understand the darkness she carried. But shared human connection is a potent antidote to trauma's lonely isolation. When Sebastian sat beside her on the porch swing for hours, holding her hand in silence, he taught her that love need not be explained to be healing. When Jeanette sent over a pot of herbal tea for body and soul, she reminded Teresa that small gestures of care form the foundation of trust. Over the course of nearly a decade, these efforts, grounding exercises, therapy, peer support, loving companionship, allowed Teresa to transform dissociation from an automatic escape hatch into a mindful tool. When the memories grew too vivid, she could gently step away, breathe deeply, and return with a steadier heart. She also learned self-compassion, speaking to herself in the mirror, "You survived what no child should ever face," rather than remaining mired in self-blame. Today, Grandma Teresa often volunteers at a local safe house for survivors, teaching simple grounding techniques and sharing her own story to give new residents hope. She never insists that everyone follow her exact path. Trauma is deeply personal, but she does underscore a universal truth. Healing requires courage, patience, and connection. It also calls for the broader community to recognize that every silent child in a household could be carrying secrets of abuse. When we reach out with a listening ear, a warm meal, or a referral to a trusted counselor, we may be offering a lifeline that changes a life forever. As we move on to Part 4, we'll examine the bold strategies Teresa employed to escape her captivity, the clandestine gathering of evidence, the forging of unlikely alliances, and the critical role of investigative journalism in breaking open her grandfather's trafficking ring. Her psychological resilience set the stage for that escape, but it was her determination to transform pain into purpose that ultimately freed her and set other victims on the path to safety. Under the dim glow of the bedside lamp, Grandma Teresa felt the weight of her grandfather's ledger books staring back at her from the old wardrobe's false bottom. Each neatly inked entry represented a transaction in which her body and the bodies of the babies she produced had been bought and sold. On those yellowed pages lay the proof she needed, but extracting it would take courage, ingenuity, and an unshakable belief that exposing Gerald's crimes could save not only her own future, but protect other vulnerable girls. First, Teresa mapped out the essential elements of her escape plan. She needed 3 things: evidence, documents, and an ally. Evidence came in the form of those ledger books, the receipts, and Dr. Augustus's own overwrought notes about each pregnancy cycle. Documents meant her birth certificate, school records, and vaccination card proof that she existed independently of Gerald's control. And an ally would be someone with the heart and the connections to help her navigate the dangerous final steps of fleeing a man who still believed he held her life in his hands. Every evening, after the house settled into its creaking silence, Teresa began her work. She had already learned where Gerald hid his keys, one on a hook by the pantry, another sewn into the lining of his favorite jacket. She chose a night when he would be in town at a business meeting, leaving his jacket draped over a chair in the parlor. Using a small piece of softened soap, she pressed and sculpted a makeshift key impression, hurriedly whisking it into her pocket before hiding Gerald's jacket back in place. Her hands trembled, but her mind was achingly calm. There was no turning back. With her improvised key, Teresa stood before Gerald's locked desk drawer, breathing in and out until her heart slowed. She opened the drawer to reveal a trove of documents, birth certificates from each child she had no power to raise, check stubs listing Dr. Augustus, the coffee farmer, and others as payers, journal entries where Gerald calculated the profit margins on a well-maintained surrogate, She took out her small Kodak camera, purchased under the pretense of photographing spring flowers, and methodically captured each page. The shutter clicks echoed like a promise. Once these images were in the right hands, Gerald's empire of exploitation would crumble. Next came the documents Teresa needed for her own identity, her fleshy, creased birth certificate, also hidden in that drawer, a faded school transcript that showed a bright child abruptly withdrawn from class, a vaccination card stamped by a midwife's shaky handwriting. She tucked those papers and the camera back into the drawer, returned the key to its hook, and smoothed her grandfather's writing desk as if nothing had happened. To all appearances, she remained Gerald's compliant, broken-spirited granddaughter. But compliance was her camouflage. There was only one person she trusted to share the truth, Mrs. Jeanette, the kindly herbalist, who had become her confidant over the years. Jeanette, with her gentle eyes and knowledge of every root and bark for healing, had already taught Teresa how to stave off forced pregnancies with discreet herbal tinctures. Now, under the pretext of an herbal consultation, Teresa slipped into Jeanette's back parlor and placed her trembling hands on Jeanette's worn wooden table. "I have everything we need," she whispered, sliding the camera into Jeanette's waiting grasp. Jeanette's sharp gaze softened as she reviewed the photographs. "This is enough to bring down an empire," she said quietly. "But you cannot carry these images back to Sacramento alone." She placed a withered hand on Teresa's. "I'll contact an old friend, a reporter who uncovered corruption in the state capitol. He'll know what to do." Within days, Jeanette arranged a clandestine meeting in a quiet cafe in downtown Sacramento. Teresa sat at a corner table, her heart pounding as she watched the reporter approach his lined face, serious his notebook and recorder in hand. He introduced himself as Michael Reed, and without preamble, Teresa laid out her story, her voice a measured whisper. In that overheated cafe room, she handed Reed a roll of film and detailed her plan for escape that very week. Reed's eyes widened as he flipped through the first few images of Ritz receipts and children's certificates. "This is a lifetime's worth of evidence," he muttered. "I'll promise to hold these safe print an article that names Gerald Augustus and others and put you on a witness protection track. But you must get out of Bakersfield immediately." Teresa nodded, feeling the last tendrils of fear and doubt slip away. She had done it. She had built her case, secured her identity, and enlisted the power of the press. That night, she packed a small bag, underwear, a simple shift dress, the few dollars she'd stashed from loose change, and a letter of introduction from Michael Reed for a legal advocate in Los Angeles. She slipped out the back window on the signal Jeanette had practiced, with 3 gentle taps on the glass, and the 2 women disappeared into the cool California darkness. Gerald slept unaware that the granddaughter he once saw merely as fertile stock was now a fugitive armed with justice. By morning, the Sacramento Bee ran a front-page exposé, Bakersfield surrogacy ring, bared granddaughter, trafficked for profit. Gerald was arrested that day, along with several complicit doctors and a sheriff who turned a blind eye. The public outcry was immediate. Calls flooded the state capitol, demanding stricter protections. For minors, mandatory reporting of suspicious surrogacy arrangements, and better funding for child protective services. Teresa watched the news from a safe house, tears in her eyes, not for herself, but for the countless other girls who might now find help before their stories repeated her own. Her escape plan, though perilous, was anchored by a few guiding lessons. First, never underestimate the power of evidence. Those ledger books, once hidden in a drawer, became the fulcrum on which Gerald's empire tipped. Second, paperwork can be as vital as any weapon. Teresa's birth certificate and school records proved her humanity, her legal personhood, and prevented Gerald from erasing her identity. Third, a trusted ally amplifies your strength. Jeanette's years of compassion and careful planning gave Teresa the emotional and logistical support she needed to ignite her escape. And finally, the truth, once told, is a force unto itself. When Michael Reed printed those images, society could no longer pretend the ring was a secret family matter. Of course, even the best laid plans carry risks. A common pitfall is rushing without adequate support. Had Teresa attempted to flee alone, she might have been intercepted, returned to Gerald's house, and punished more severely. Others misplace their faith in digital security photographing evidence only to have devices seized by traffickers. Teresa's analog camera, hidden in a ribboned box, proved less suspect than a smartphone might have been. And some victims trust too quickly, sending their evidence to strangers rather than vetted journalists or nonprofit legal teams. Teresa's alliance with Michael Reed and Jeanette, both known quantities, removed that danger. Another mistake survivors make is failing to protect their own emotional well-being during the escape. The adrenaline surge can carry you out of captivity, but the emotional aftermath, panic attacks, dissociation, guilt, can immobilize you in a new environment. Teresa's carefully timed transition to a secure safe house, paired with counseling arranged by Reed's contacts, offered her the stability she needed to catch her breath and process the events. Today, as we look back on Part 4 of Grandma Teresa's journey, we see that her escape was neither luck nor happenstance. It was the result of meticulous planning, bravery in the face of unthinkable risk, and a refusal to let fear sequester her voice. In Part 5, we will explore how she rebuilt her life beyond Bakersfield's borders, the bakery job that taught her to knead dough and trust her hands again, the love she found in Sebastian's steadfast presence, and the family she forged through adoption and community. Above all, we will see how Teresa's story of resilience became a beacon for other survivors, proof that even the most oppressive chains can be broken when we dare to gather evidence, enlist allies, and tell the truth. After fleeing Bakersfield under the cover of night, Teresa arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but a small satchel of clothes and her precious roll of film. The city's sprawl felt overwhelming at first. Endless boulevards, strangers' faces in every direction, neon lights shining too brightly against the darkness she carried in her heart. Yet, it was here, amid the clatter of the early morning bakery ovens, that she found her first foothold toward a new life. On her first day at the little neighborhood bakery, she took a deep breath before stepping inside. The owner, Mrs. Alvarez, greeted her with a warm smile and showed her how to measure flour and knead dough until it felt smooth under her fingertips. "Bread is magic," Mrs. Alvarez said, wiping flour from her hands. "It feeds bodies and hearts." Teresa learned to shape baguettes, braid challah, and fold croissants. With each loaf she pulled from the oven, its crust crackling on top. Something in her relaxed. The scent of yeast became a balm, reminding her that creation could follow destruction. Those mornings in the bakery taught Teresa two invaluable lessons. First, that trust could be built through small acts of competence and kindness, and second, that earning one's keep with honest labor helped stitch back the frayed edges of self-worth. Standing behind the counter, offering a warm roll to a regular customer who complimented her baking, she felt a spark of confidence she hadn't known in years. 6 months into her new routine, on a rainy March morning, Sebastian walked in. He was a bus driver, with kind eyes and a laugh that bounced like a spring tune against the tile floor. He ordered a coffee and a warm almond croissant, then complimented her on the flaky layers. "You have magic in your hands," he said, gesturing to the pastries. Something in the way he spoke, without pity, without probing, made Teresa feel seen for the first time as a person, not an object. Their friendship grew in measured steps. Sebastian would arrive early for his shift, buy a loaf of bread for his aunt, and linger as Teresa wrapped up pastries. They spoke of simple things, the weather, traffic patterns, his dream of having a small ranch one day. He asked about Teresa's dreams only once. She told him she longed for peace. He nodded as if that contained everything he needed to know. It took another year before Teresa felt safe enough to share fragments of her past. One evening after closing the bakery, she led Sebastian to her tiny apartment and in soft, halting words recounted the ledger books, the pregnancies, the escape. She braced for shock, for horror in his eyes. But Sebastian simply took her hand. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said, "and I love you, all of you." In that moment, her heart cracked open in a new way, a broken heart, discovering that vulnerability could coexist with love. They married 3 years later in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church in East LA. Teresa wore a simple white dress, and Sebastian waited for her at the altar, his eyes glistening. Their vows were straightforward promises to trust, to protect, and to grow together. As they emerged into the sunshine, Teresa felt something unfamiliar, but wonderful. She felt free. Home, for the new couple, was a rented cottage near the Arroyo Seco. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling, but they saw potential. With Sebastian's support, Teresa began meeting with a psychologist trained in trauma-informed therapy. She learned to name her feelings without shame, to practice grounding exercises when nightmares struck, and to build a narrative of survival rather than defeat. She kept a journal where she sketched faces, her own, her children's, she had never touched, and now her own future children, whether real or hopeful. In 1984, after 2 years of marriage and ongoing desire to nurture children, Teresa and Sebastian decided to pursue adoption. Doctors informed them that Teresa's body, worn by 10 forced pregnancies, could not safely carry another child. They grieved the loss of a biological child, but felt relief, no more secret panic at the first sign of nausea. Together, they navigated the bureaucratic maze. Home visits, interviews, background checks. Every yes they received began to stitch a new family tapestry in bright threads of hope. Their first child arrived through adoption in 1986, Marina, a 4-year-old girl with wide, curious eyes and a guarded smile. She'd been in foster care after her teenage mother abandoned her at a hospital. In the shelter, she learned to clasp her heart against disappointment. When Teresa and Sebastian first approached her, Marina recoiled, but Teresa, recalling her own survival tactics, gave her space. She sat a few feet away, her voice soft, singing a lullaby from her grandmother's childhood. On the 3rd day, Marina let Teresa brush her hair. On the 10th, she asked to hold Teresa's hand. In that small act of courage, Marina reaching out, Teresa felt the fulfillment of every womb she'd carried in the dark. 2 years later, siblings Carlos, age 6, and Anna, age 2, joined their growing family. They'd lost both parents in a car crash and lived briefly with an uncle who couldn't care for them. Carlos, protective beyond his years, clung to Teresa's skirt whenever new faces appeared. Anna, toddler-sized and startled at every loud noise hid in corners. Teresa and Sebastian learned to balance boundaries with reassurance. Carlos was taught how to use his words. Anna learned that holding a soft blanket and listening to gut-wrenching night prayers could calm her storms. The house, once quiet, filled with laughter, arguments over bedtime, and impromptu games of hide-and-seek. In 1990, a third adoption brought Wim, a 3-month-old infant, left on a church doorstep with no identifying papers. He had only a tiny footprint in ink to mark his beginning. Marina insisted on cradling him. Carlos declared himself Wim's official protector, and Anna brought him squeaky ducks for bath time. In their care, Wim bloomed quickly, his first laugh echoing across the kitchen, a sure sign of a child who knew love at last. As the children grew, so did Teresa's commitment to community. She volunteered at Safe Horizons, a shelter for survivors of domestic abuse and trafficking. There, she led grounding workshops and shared her story with new residents, always emphasizing that they were not defined by what happened to them, but by what they chose to do next. She worked side by side with social workers, lawyers, and fellow survivors, shaping policies to improve intake interviews and post-release support. In 1995, Teresa and Sebastian bought a small ranch in Riverside County. The house was modest, with a red barn and a fenced-in pasture. They planted orange trees, raised chickens, and made room for children's laughter to echo across the fields. On Sunday afternoons, neighbors would come by for fresh bread and coffee. The children fed the goats, and Teresa would watch them, her heart full. The ranch was proof that redemption could take root even in soil once tainted by exploitation. In time, the legacy of her first 10 children, those she never held, blended into her work. She lobbied for Open Records Acts that made it easier for adult adoptees to discover their birth histories. She advised investigative journalists writing about surrogacy laws, and she encouraged foster families to keep memory books for children who'd been through multiple placements so that no child's story would ever be forgotten or erased. By 2010, 3 generations gathered under one roof, the 4 adopted children, grown into their own gifts. Marina, the elementary school teacher. Carlos, the mechanic with a gentle touch. Anna, the budding musician. And Wim, the compassionate pediatric nurse. Sebastian and Teresa, gray-haired partners who prayed on the porch swing at dusk. And a new brood of grandchildren who chased chickens and discovered hidden nooks in the barn. At family gatherings, the table overflowed with stories, home-baked pies, and the joyful noise that only a large, loving family can make. Through it all, Teresa remained a storyteller, a grandmother weaving cautionary tales of injustice alongside testimonies of healing. She recorded her memoir, not to dwell on darkness, but to shine a light for those still trapped in shadows. In online forums, she answered messages from women who feared authorities would not believe them, offering them the exact numbers for hotlines that once saved her life. She sat on panels advocating for stricter surrogacy regulations and survivor-centered foster care reforms. She deliberately used her voice so that no child born into desperation, would feel as alone as she once did. Looking back, Teresa recognized that her life had taken an extraordinary arc from stolen childhood to reclaimed agency, from a hidden ledger in a dusty drawer to a front-page headline demanding justice. Yet her quiet pride lay in the everyday moments, the giggle of a grandchild, the sunrise over the orange grove, the gentle patter of flour on her apron. She often told audiences, freedom is more than escape. It's the daily choice to breathe, to build, and to love. And that love, persistent, patient, transformative, was the true legacy she handed down. In the end, her story was not just her own. It belonged to every survivor who learned step by step that a stolen life could be rebuilt, that a damaged heart could heal, and that with the support of community, even the deepest darkness can give way to dawn. As we close this final chapter of Grandma Teresa's journey, let us carry forward her message. No system is perfect, no darkness unfathomable, and no person beyond redemption. If we see a child in need, let us act. If we witness abuse hidden by polite society, let us speak. And if we ourselves bear the scars of trauma, let us remember healing is possible and hope can flourish once more in even the most barren soil.